there, welcome to my curious kitchen. Today we're going to be making pesto parmesan challah. So challah is traditionally a Jewish bread that's eaten on special occasions and for certain holidays. In the US, it's come to refer to a type of bread that's rich and eggy and braided pretty intricately. Today, while I make this challah, I'm going to focus on the science behind the different ingredients and all the steps that go into making challah, but also most breads. So let's get started. So I've prepared all of my ingredients that I'm going to use here, and I'm going to start just by explaining a little bit of what they're going to be doing. So first, of course, we have a lot of flour. I've separated it into two bowls because the recipe says to start with a certain portion and then add more as we go along. And I'll explain a little more about why that's important when we get to it. Here we're using bread flour, which contains more protein than all-purpose flour. So it has more gluten in it already, and gluten is really important for the structure of the bread, and we'll talk more about what it does later. I also have some sugar. So this challah at least is what's considered an enriched dough, which means it contains a lot of sugar and fat. So that makes it really tender and rich. So the sugar is going to contribute to that tenderness, and it's also going to help feed our yeast. So of course we also have yeast. So yeast are living microorganisms, and these are actually what's going to give our bread the air it needs to get a really big rise and a nice texture. So just like all organisms, yeast need to eat, and they eat sugars. And as they eat, they also produce waste. So carbon dioxide and ethanol and some acidic compounds that are really nice for flavor. We're gonna get them all from the yeast. This recipe also uses an egg. Eggs are really cool in baking. They have a lot of different functions. For breads, usually we say that eggs contribute fat, a lot of the fat in the yolk, to also give it a really rich, tender texture, but the whites contain a lot of water, and there's a lot of protein in eggs as well. We have some salt. Salt in baking is often used as a flavor enhancer. So for example, salt can suppress bitter flavors, which would help to bring other flavors out. Finally, we have some oil, which I've put into this measuring cup here. So oil, of course, is another fat, so it's going to help contribute to tenderness by preventing the gluten from forming. And it's going to help us make a really nice, rich dough. We're also going to add a lot of water, which we're going to have to heat up, so I haven't prepared it yet, but I'll show you it when we get there. Another note, for the flour and the sugar, it's really important to measure it accurately. So I like to use a scale. I have a digital one right here. But because flour especially is so easy to pack into the measuring cup, it's easy to get too much. So I like to use a scale to make sure I use the right amount of flour. If you use too much flour, your baked good can end up really kind of dense and tough. If you only have measuring cups, be sure to fluff the flour up with a fork or something, and then gently spoon it into your measuring cup, and then use the back of a knife or a chopstick or something and level it off. So the first step of the recipe is to dissolve the yeast with some sugar in warm water. So here I have water that's been warmed to a little over 100 degrees, between 100 and 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And I'm just going to add my yeast in, a little sugar, and then let it dissolve in the water. And we're gonna give it 5 or 10 minutes or so until we start to see foam at the surface of the water. So you can see right now, it's cloudy because of the yeast, of course, but the top is just water. and then we'll take another look in a few minutes or so. So for this part, the temperature of the water is crucial, honestly. So yeast, like I said, are living organisms. So living organisms have their optimal temperature range. If it's too high, the yeast will outright die. And if it's too cold, it's going to take some time for them to kind of get acclimated and get warmed up and start, eating as fast as they can. So generally we want it to be around 100 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're just going to wait. Actually, you can kind of see it already. If we take a closer look, you can see there's bubbles here on the surface where the carbon dioxide is. And if we look from the side, you can see a clear layer of liquid and then the layer of foam on top. So our yeast is actually good to go, and we can actually proceed with this recipe. Okay, now that the yeast are ready, let's start with the dough. So as you can see, we took a few more minutes and we're getting a really tall layer of bubbles up top there. So our yeast are definitely nice and happy. So here I have about 1.5 cups or about 200 grams of the bread flour. And I'm going to add to it our salt and our sugar and I guess briefly mix it up a little bit. Salt actually inhibits yeast growth. So whenever you're making bread, you don't want to put the yeast and the salt directly next to each other. You can kind of put the salt down, then add your flour, and then add your yeast on top. Or like this, we are mixing the salt into the flour. But since our yeast are activated anyway, it's not as big of a deal here. But just going to add my yeasty water into the bowl. So just gonna give that a stir. And you can already see it's coming together. So when we add water to the flour hydrates. And so all of the proteins and the starch that are in the flour start to absorb the water and become hydrated. And that's when they start to act the way we expect it to act. So the gluten-forming proteins, once they become wet, they can start to link up and form gluten. So we can think about the gluten proteins as like little slinky coils scattered throughout the dough. And once they're wet, they can start kind of linking up together and forming a really large elastic net. And that's actually what's going to trap our gases in the bread dough. So all the carbon dioxide gas the yeast are creating, it's like they're blowing up a balloon, and then the gluten is the balloon trapping the air inside. So we want that balloon to be really strong so it can trap all of the air and we can get a really nice rise. So after all this is incorporated pretty well, I'm going to add the egg and a little more of the flour, maybe like half the remaining flour. And the reason we're adding the flour in portions is so we can make sure we're absorbing the new liquid that we're adding, in this case with the egg, because we want everything to be really evenly incorporated. And so after we have all the ingredients together, all that's really left to do is to knead. So kneading is a really important part of a lot of bread recipes because it develops the gluten. So like I said, we can think about the gluten as little slinkies scattered throughout the dough. And when we knead it, we're essentially aligning them together into a big strong web. So this is really sticky right now. So I'm going to continue adding flour. And I like this recipe because it tells you to reserve some flour for when you're kneading the dough. we want to be careful when we knead not to incorporate too much flour. Like I was saying earlier, extra flour is going to make the dough really dense and tough. And so this recipe tells you to reserve about 1/4 cup. And so the recipe I'm using today is adapted from Sharon's Sarna. I got it off of kosher.com. But I basically halved it and then converted the volume measurements to weight measurements. Okay, so now that that's coming together, I'm going to scatter the remaining flour on the bench and turn out the dough so I can really get it kneaded. So at this point, we are worried mostly about the gluten. Because the yeast are already active, our goal now is to make sure our bread dough has enough gluten in it to trap all that gas the yeast are going to create. So like I said earlier, bread flour already has a lot of the proteins needed to create gluten. And so when we added water to it, we already got started with the gluten formation. But now we are going to really encourage it. So kneading is more about pulling the gluten strands and then realigning them. So as you can see here, we want to push away and then fold back over. So we want to push away and fold back over. It's more about the pushing away motion than the pressing down. And this dough is still really soft, so it's going to take a little bit. But just for comparison, let's take a look at this dough right now. Like I said, it's really soft. And when I pull it, it kind of just comes straight apart. Like that. There's no stretchiness to it at all. So I've been kneading the dough and I added a little more flour, but I think it's pretty much there. So if we take a look, it's pretty smooth. And if we start to stretch it, we can actually get it to the point where we can see light through it. Actually, we call this the window pane test. It's one way to tell if your gluten is developed enough. So you should be able to stretch it to the point where you see light coming through it before it breaks. So I think this is ready. So now we're going to let it rise. But before we do that, we're going to shape it into a little ball. And this process actually helps it hold gas better as it rises. And it also helps the gluten continue to develop. So what I'm going to do is this is the top. I'm going to pull little corners from the top and tuck it kind of to the bottom of the dough. So I'm just going around the ball and tucking. So it should form a nice rounded ball. And now that that's done, we can flip him back over. And I'm just gonna pop this into a greased bowl and cover it and let it rise. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening. I'm gonna go wash my hands and then we'll chat. All right, so let's talk about what's going on as the dough is rising. So essentially, now that we've developed the gluten, we can let the yeast blow up the gluten balloon. So after all of our kneading, we get a really nice web of gluten throughout the entire dough. So as the yeast continue to eat sugars and produce their gas and ethanol waste, the gluten can trap it all in the dough. Yeast are living organisms and they are affected by a lot of different factors. And one of the biggest ones that we can control is temperature. So the warmer it is, the faster the yeast will work up until like 140 degrees Fahrenheit or so when they die. So we can actually take this dough and put it in the refrigerator, but then the yeast will move much slower and it will take a longer time for the bread to rise. Something else we have to think about then is where is all of this sugar coming from? We did add some sugar, but it's not necessarily enough to feed the yeast through this first rise or shaping, our second rise, and into the oven. So the yeast actually also get food from the flour. So flour contains starch. Starch is actually plant's way of storing energy. So when a plant photosynthesizes and gets all its energy from sunlight, it stores it away so in case it can't make food in the future, it has food ready to go. So flour contains starch, and also a lot of commercially bought flour contains something called amylase. So amylase is an enzyme, it's like a little robot that goes around and like eats the sugars off the long starch chain. Amylase is found in a lot of living organisms, like our saliva has it. And it's actually added to flours because white flour by itself doesn't really have much. So while the dough is rising, the amylase little choppers are taking sugars off the larger starch chains. The yeast are coming by and eating these sugars in order to survive and to reproduce. And in the process, as they're eating, they're making gas and alcohol. And fun fact, this alcohol is the exact same alcohol that we drink in, vodka or beer or whatever. It's the same thing, except when we bake our bread, the ethanol evaporates off, whereas they don't do that in the breweries. So again, recipes will often give you guidelines, let your dough rise for an hour or 3 hours, or put it in the fridge overnight. But they'll also typically say until it's doubled in size, and that's really the better indicator because the recipe developer doesn't know your kitchen conditions, they don't know how cold it is or how warm it is, so it's better to wait until your dough is doubled in size. For recipes that have 2 rises, you can't really overproof the first time. As long as your dough still has enough starches and sugar in it to feed the yeast, you can continue, punching down the dough and getting rid of the gas and letting it rise some more. It'll usually last, 2 or 3 days if you put it in the fridge, and still have enough starch in there for the yeast. So now we have our dough rising, and make sure to come back for part 2 where we're going to be shaping the dough, letting it rise for the second time, and baking it. So thanks for watching and stay tuned.